capital, combinando análises macroeconômicas em linha com o que o Paulo Leme trouxe, segurança nacional e implicações de mercado. Esse próximo painel, ele propõe um olhar sobre como o novo realismo americano pode estar redefinindo alianças, cadeias produtivas e oportunidades de investimentos ao redor do mundo. Para esta conversa hoje, queremos chamar aqui ao palco Fabiano Sintra, Head de Fundos Internacionais da XP, e Thomas Mucha, estrategista geopolítico da Wellington. Uma salva de palmas, sejam muito bem-vindos. Please welcome to the stage. Excelente painel para vocês.
I like that music. It's very optimistic.
Bom dia a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindos mais uma vez aqui ao XP Global Conference. Eu particularmente estou muito feliz de ver vários rostos aqui, familiares que estão com a gente no dia a dia, todos reunidos aqui em Miami. Acho que é sinal que um grande movimento está acontecendo, as tomadas de decisões estão aqui e que a gente está no caminho certo. Bom, eu sou o Fabiano Sintra, sou responsável por fundos internacionais na XP. E hoje acho que o nosso papo vai ser sobre esse grande tabuleiro geopolítico atual. O Paulo comentou agora sobre a guerra no Irã. Sem dúvida vai ser um tema que a gente vai explorar aqui com o Thomas. Mas será que tem um movimento muito maior acontecendo? Será que esse é só um capítulo, né, de um ciclo mais longo, mais lento, que às vezes escapa um pouco das manchetes e do nosso olhar? A verdade é que nas últimas décadas, o investidor brasileiro, a gente mesmo, a gente aprendeu a analisar o quê? Inflação, juros, crescimento econômico, mas talvez a variável mais importante, mais relevante dos mercados recentemente tenha sido política. A globalização, que parecia sempre inevitável, dada, incrivelmente ela começou a dar sinais de retrocesso, né? Quem diria, a globalização. Cadeias produtivas inteiras sendo totalmente redesenhadas. Os países voltando a falar de segurança alimentar, segurança energética, segurança tecnológica, por que não? Então, a pergunta para a gente aqui, ela central, ela deixou de ser apenas qual que vai ser o juro. Ela passou a ser também qual poderá ser o próximo conflito no horizonte. Então, para entender como que a política internacional ela virou variável de preço de ativo, hoje a gente vai ter o privilégio de conversar com o Thomas Mucha, que ele é estrategista de geopolítica da Wellington. Bom, a Wellington é uma grande parceira da XP, é uma gestora com nada mais, nada menos com 100 anos, mais de 100 anos de experiência, mais de $1 trilhão sob gestão. Então, acho que é uma verdadeira autoridade mundial, a gente não poderia estar em melhores mãos aqui. E o Thomas tem mestrado da Universidade de Chicago, esteve por muitos anos na televisão, tá? Ele passou mais de uma década por vários canais, incluindo a CNN International, em Londres, em Nova York e outros canais. Então, Joana, Jorge, muito obrigado por terem cedido o Thomas aqui para a gente. Vamos lá. Bom, acho que o tema da geopolítica não podia estar mais quente do que agora, né? A gente está no meio de uma guerra no Oriente Médio, mergulhado nesse mar de incertezas. Vocês viram os cenários de probabilidade do Paulo. A verdade é que a gente não sabe. E a gente ainda não tem muita convicção, né, pessoal? Se essa é apenas uma guerra regional ou se, na verdade, a gente está testemunhando um movimento maior. Um desdobramento lento, gradual, de um evento que pode ficar marcado para sempre nos livros de história. Para sempre na história dos nossos filhos também. Então, acho que vale a atenção aqui ao tema. Thomas, switching to English now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here with us. It's an honor, it's a privilege. If I may suggest that we start by zooming out a little bit to try to capture the big picture of what is actually happening, okay? So this war seems to be maybe just a chapter of a much bigger story, maybe a story of degradation of the international order, why not? Is that a thing, such as geopolitical cycle? Are we seeing perhaps the biggest change since the World War II?
Thank you, Fabio, for the question, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for having me. The Wellington's relationship with XP is very important to us, so it's an honor to be here. I was just in Brazil for 2 days, 3 days last week as well, so it's good to see some familiar faces here in Miami. So I'm going to focus my answer on what I hear from the policymakers. I think that's a very important variable as we try to navigate what is a very complex, very unpredictable, and frankly, very dangerous geopolitical environment. And so in my role at Wellington, I spend a lot of time talking to policymakers. So current and former Pentagon, CIA, State Department, National Security Council officials. I spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill talking to legislators on both sides of the aisle. I also speak with defense and intelligence professionals all around the world, in Europe, Asia, everywhere else. And what I think is important here is to understand how the policymakers are viewing the world. And it's quite a pessimistic view that they have. I've done this for a long time. I've never seen them so focused on the geopolitical and national security backdrops. And I think, to your question, I think there are a couple of structural factors that are leading to this new focus on national security globally. And the first is the cycle. So yes, I do agree that geopolitics has a cycle. I'm also an economist. I love cycles. I appreciated Paulo's presentation very much. But geopolitical cycles tend to be very long. When I say long, they tend to be historically 80 to 100 years. So long, very long cycles. We're currently in year 82 of what has been a very long and very stable geopolitical cycle, and lots of wonderful things have happened over that 82-year period. We had globalization, we had economic integration, we had the free flow of ideas, goods, and people across borders. But what I detect from the policymakers today is a move away from that. And I think what's happening is we're coming to an end of what has been this very long geopolitical cycle, and we're moving to something else. And typically in history, when you get to those transition periods between cycles, that's when you tend to get the conflict, that's when you tend to get the wars, that's when you tend to get the disruptions and volatility across the geopolitical environment. That's what we're seeing today. In fact, we currently have 65 active conflicts around the world today, and that includes between states or armed uprisings within states. 65. That's double where it was just 5 years ago. Right, so this is a big number, but it's a very significant number. This also includes about 23 coups or coup attempts over the past 3 years. And so there's a lot of geopolitical instability that the policymakers are detecting, and I think they're responding to it. And what I've seen is a much greater focus as a result of this ending of the geopolitical cycle on national security over economic efficiency. And so the policymakers that I talk to, view the world through this lens of how can individual countries, how can individual policymakers respond to this level of uncertainty and violence, and how do they do that through the policy lens? They try to spend more on defense. They try to pay more attention to strategic assets that every country has. But most importantly, they are favoring actions that they believe will improve their national security. So from an investment perspective, that's different, right? If I was here 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and you asked me, well, what are the policy priorities? I would say they're about integration, they're about globalization, right? Today, those are shifting in very important ways. But I think the geopolitical cycle, the ending of that, is core to that. There's one other very important strategic and cyclical structural factor, I would say, structural factor that's also leading to this destabilized geopolitical environment, and that's climate change. And I don't think the markets fully understand the link between climate change and geopolitical instability. But I can promise you, if I'm talking to the CIA, the Pentagon, the State Department, every policymaker I talk to at NATO headquarters in Brussels really views climate change through this national security lens because of where climate change is hitting hardest. It tends to be the equator all the way around the world, and the tropics, 30 degrees north and south of there. And the Pentagon looks at that, they call it the hot zone, and they're expecting a lot more geopolitical disruption over the next decade, a lot more resource wars, food and water scarcity issues, climate migration, right, and other geopolitical disruptions in this area that's already home to most of the problem spots, East, West, North Africa, the entire Middle East. Iran is in this hot zone, Afghanistan, large parts of Taiwan, large parts of the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera. And so to me, you've got these two big structural factors, the 1 in a 80, 1 in a 100-year reordering of the global world, but also climate change stresses. And so to me, that's where you want to start. And that So I think you're right to identify the US-China relationship as the key variable. If you're going to pay attention to one thing in geopolitics over the next year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it's the US-China relationship. That is the central question. If the United States and China can manage through this very complex, this ever-shifting geopolitical environment without conflict, then we're going to be in a very different stage if the United States and China stumble into a catastrophic situation. Every conversation that I have across my policy context focuses first on the US-China relationship, and so that is correct. Now, what do the policymakers think? The policymakers think that China already represents the biggest challenge to the US-led international order. That was a big part of this stabilization period that I talked about over the past 80 years. And most of the national security and other policymaker contexts I have across the West also share this view, right? That China is representing something of a threat to the existing global order. It's why you see a lot of unity still between the United States, NATO countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and others. And so the policymakers do view this along those lines. What does China want? I think what's happening here is quite natural, and it's something that you've seen throughout history. And what do you see? When a country becomes more powerful economically, through trade, and just becomes a bigger part of the global picture, it naturally wants to increase its national security footprint. It wants a bigger say in how the world operates. That is natural. We've seen that over and over in history. So what you're seeing in China, to me, is, again, a natural outgrowth of what happens as a result of a country that grows in power economically. They transfer that power and translate that power into diplomatic and military forms. Now that has a reaction, right? And most of the contexts that I talk to around the world view this through something called the Thucydides trap. Anybody here study ancient Greek history? Right? People like the Greeks. I like the Greeks. Every geopolitical strategist has to understand this. But when I go to the Pentagon, the CIA, elsewhere, they all talk about the Thucydides trap. And it's a very simple idea. It's, can an existing power accept the rise of a challenging power without stumbling into conflict? And again, this happens all the time in history. If you look at this dynamic, it stretches all the way back to the Peloponnesian Wars, Athens versus Sparta. But this is, of course, the United States and China. This is the key geopolitical dynamic right now. But if you look throughout history, this happens all the time. Over the past 500 years, we've had 16 examples of this so-called Thucydides trap. 12 of those 16 have ended in conflict. So it's a very challenging dynamic. It's very disruptive to international relations because the existing power feels threatened by the rising power, tries to take steps to keep the rising power down. The existing power takes steps to try to improve its position, and you get trapped. And that's what the Thucydides trap is. And so I think that's the dominant policy focus from my perspective. That's what the policymakers I talk to focus on. But you asked, what does China want? I think China wants to do what is natural in international relations history and have a bigger role globally. It's focused primarily on its own backyard, right? Everything that we've seen over the past 10 years has been really focused in particular on the Taiwan issue, the South China Sea, the East China Sea. So China does not have yet the global military footprint that the United States has. China doesn't have the global alliance network that the United States has with military bases all over. China just currently has one military base in the Middle East, for example, in Djibouti. So I think China is really focused first on its backyard, but the real question among the policymakers is how far does that extend? And again, can the United States and China manage through this from a geopolitical level? And that is the outstanding question. And I think the Iran war makes that even more challenging, right? We've just heard President Trump over the weekend say, well, maybe I won't meet with President Xi in Beijing in a couple of weeks. And from China's perspective, you look at the United States' last two foreign policy excursions, Venezuela, Iran, right? Those are very strategic, important countries for China. So again, there are stresses that are flowing through the U.S.-China relationship that are tied to this broader geopolitical destabilization. But again, China, U.S., that's the variable that I think we should be monitoring today and into the future.
So would you say that we might be entering a new Cold War between the U.S. and China? And most importantly, can we still consider the U.S. and the U.S. dollar as a safe haven of the world?
I'm not a huge fan of the term Cold War in this context. Because if you look at the historical parallels, so the Cold War, of course, refers to the U.S., USSR, long-running challenge. There was very little economic integration between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. That is certainly not the case in the U.S.-China relationship, and I don't think either country wants to completely decouple from the other. So what you're seeing instead, and you're seeing this from China, you're seeing this from the United States, you're seeing this in countries all around the world, is policymakers are identifying, let's say, 8 to 10 strategic sectors that they believe are critical in winning this long-running great power competition. So what are those industries that are going to help each side compete better over the long run? And what are those 8 to 10 sectors where each side wants to de-risk from the other side? It doesn't want to be too dependent on the other side, given the geopolitical stresses. So when I got to Wellington 11 years ago, the first thing that the Pentagon started talking to me about was semiconductors. This is 11 years ago. And they were very focused on the semiconductor sector for the main reason that you can't run a modern military without semiconductors. You can't run artificial intelligence models without the top semiconductor models. So it was no surprise to me that we got the CHIPS Act, that we got CFIUS controls on semiconductors, that we got more export controls, that the Trump administration is using tariffs on semiconductors. But what's happening is much broader than just semiconductors. It's a series of industries that are getting more protection and promotion from policymakers. Critical minerals is the current issue that I'm hearing most from my policymakers, but it's a whole host of industries that are viewed as strategic, where the United States and China and other countries are trying to strategically decouple. Space, very much in focus, aerospace and space. That's the new high ground in the military sense. Robotics, automation, drones, quantum computing, artificial intelligence is central to all of this. And so instead of a Cold War framing, I think what we're seeing here is a fracturing of the global economy, but centered on these core national security issues. And so you're going to see, more fragmentation of supply chains. You're going to see more fragmentation of trade patterns. And to your question about the dollar, I think we're going to see more fragmentation when it comes to the role of the US dollar as the reserve currency. And you're starting to see that, right? I don't think the United States or the dollar is in any immediate risk of losing that reserve currency status. But what you're seeing is steps by China to de-dollarize its economy. So it's denoting a lot more trade in RMB, and it's creating a lot more currency swaps with countries all around the world. So China is laying the groundwork to create a more diversified currency backdrop. But at the moment, I think that is, part of the conversation, but that's farther down the road. But you're starting to see those pressures on the dollar.
Thank you. Moving to the Middle East now, right? We just saw the oil prices hitting $108 a barrel, right? And for weeks we've been following the war in Iran. But I wonder, Thomas, what is this war actually about? What does it mean to win the war? What are the final goals of the conflict?
That's been one of the difficult things to pin down in the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House, right? There have been shifting messages about all of this. But I'm gonna steer back to my initial point here, which is in a world that is seen by policymakers as so disrupted, so chaotic, so potentially dangerous, right? We're up to, unfortunately, more than 2,000 people have already died in this conflict. So this is a real conflict with real humanitarian and human consequences. But you're seeing policymakers act more aggressively when they view their national security at stake. Right? We saw that with Putin and the Ukraine invasion. He very much framed that as a national security issue for Russia. I think we're seeing the same thing here in this conflict. So at the root of it, you have President Trump and President Netanyahu very much focused on the risk that Iran poses to the region through its proxy networks, through its very extensive, or what was extensive, ballistic and cruise missile arsenal, through its drone capabilities, and especially its nuclear weapons program. And so I think that at the root of it, if you want to cut through all the noise, it's about degrading Iran's capacity across all of these national security dimensions: cruise missiles, drones, and then of course, ballistic and cruise missiles, but also the nuclear piece is central to that. So at the end of the day, they're looking for a way to, say, well, we have credibly, degraded these military capacities. Now, of course, the Iranians have a vote in this, and to the question about the uncertainty around crude, LNG, other shipping risks, it is very much centered on the Strait of Hormuz, of course, but specifically Iran's ability to extend the conflict. And I think that's what we're seeing. And this is what's complicating the objectives, right? I think what you're seeing here is something of a race between superior military capabilities, the joint U.S.-Israeli capabilities. Can they degrade these capabilities fast enough to declare victory and get out? And on the other side, the Iranians' ability to use asymmetric means, drones, but particularly mining around the Strait of Hormuz. Can they extend this to the point where the U.S. is just, or President Trump in particular, can't take it anymore, right? So, and that's where we are. And I'm in the camp that this war, while it could end tomorrow, right? He could decide, okay, we've done enough. I still think if you look at the military realities on the ground, they're not quite there, and I still think we're a couple of weeks away from getting some resolution here. And so along that time horizon, it's really going to come down to the Strait of Hormuz, what kind of shipping is coming through, is shipping coming through, and then that, of course, bleeds into inflation prints, into monetary policy issues, all of the other variables that we care about on a day-to-day basis. And so again, it's a highly uncertain situation. It's going to be, but that, I think, is part of the new normal. If leaders are focusing more on national security concerns, right, we shouldn't take our own assumptions about, well, what's good for the markets and impose that necessarily onto their decision-making tree, because they're coming at it from a different perspective now.
And what do you think are the signals and indicators that the war might be coming to an end?
Sure. So there's a bunch. The first one, of course, is shipping, right, in the Strait. If that returns to normal, that to me is the most important variable. That's the one that is going to determine that we are coming to a close here. But I'm looking at a bunch of other variables that I think are important here. The first is Iran's capacity to enact retaliatory strikes. And yes, those numbers have gone down quite significantly, but they are nowhere near zero. And Iran maintains the capacity to continue to threaten shipping, to continue to threaten the ability to lay mines in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a very important development because mine laying and mine clearing are highly complex military operations that could extend this conflict for quite some time. And then, of course, Iran is still hitting select targets across the Gulf. There was an attack just today on Dubai Airport, right? So the capacity here for Iran to strike back is something that I'm watching. I'm also watching, well, what is the flow of U.S. military equipment and men and others, aspects of this? Is the U.S. increasing its footprint or decreasing its footprint in the region? And at the moment, the U.S. is still increasing its military footprint in the region, and at the same time, it's urging Americans to leave, like all of the areas to leave. They shut down a bunch of the embassies, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, those are the key variables, and the variables still, as of this morning, suggest a longer conflict of weeks at least.
Just a couple questions more on Iran. I'm going to open for a few questions on the topic before we move on. So feel free to raise your hand. I'm curious about, you were there in local, right? So how Iranians are reacting to all of this? Do you see internal support against all these interventions? Do you think it's actually feasible to consider to remove the regime, or this is just not technically possible?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a key question. I think that was one of the main factors why President Trump took this gamble. And I think they calculated that this was the best opportunity for the U.S. and Israel to try to trigger a regime change from the bottom up. And the reason I say that is not only because Iran's military capacity had been degraded by the earlier conflicts, the 12-day war in the region, but in January and into February, the Iranian government killed about 35,000 Iranians. So I think they determined that, well, look at the domestic factors on the ground, look at the military factors, And I think they decided that this was the opportune time to take that gamble to remove the regime. They, of course, tried to do that, right? The first strike in the conflict eliminated not only the top layer of leadership, but the second layer of leadership. And then since then, particularly early on, the goal from a military standpoint was to degrade Iran's capacity to crack down on internal dissent. So they targeted IRGC facilities, they targeted Besiege, the secret police that are responsible for controlling domestic populations. They are continuing to make those strikes, but so far to no avail. And I think what you saw in the early days of the conflict was a very robust response by the IRGC, by internal security forces, to deliver the messages across Tehran and around the country to, we will come get you, we will crack down again if there's an uprising. So clearly, if you look at the protests earlier in the year, there's a lot of public support for a new regime in Iran. The best estimates I have are around 20% of the country only supports the current government. So that means 80% are ready for change, but they don't have the ability at the moment to really enact regime change. And we haven't seen that yet. So we will see, but I do think the likely outcome here is this current regime has shown resilience and is likely to stick around in some form or another.
Fantastic. So before we move on here, one or two questions, if you want to. Podem fazer em português também, a gente traduz aqui se for o caso.
Yeah, please don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Hi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Actually, my question is about the technology that we are deep in the AI business, and if you could say something about this geopolitical war and discussion about the technology that all the countries need to provide, and if Trump is he can decide when he gets on the end of the war, or if he say, "Oh, I've done enough," but you have a rebound from other countries. So I don't know if it's on his hand actually.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think every war is unpredictable, right? And every war sort of takes on unintended consequences. And so one of the messages that I want to deliver today is, there's a lot of potential outcomes here, right? From it ending tomorrow to it going on for 6 months or longer, right? And so as investors, one of the key messages I have is we need to do more scenario planning on a portfolio by portfolio basis, on a strategy by strategy basis. This is a conflict that's quite unpredictable, given that it's happening in the center of the Middle East, which is the most complex geopolitical environment and has been for centuries. And given that the Trump administration's goal here is to maximize optionality, right? The president has 10 to 15 options that are put in front of him every day. He picks one or two, and then you get the next day, then the next day. So again, I think we want to be more imaginative in how we're thinking about the outcomes here. Now, on your first point, and thank you for the question, I think one of the least understood aspects of the current artificial intelligence debate is really around national security, specifically around the national security uses of artificial intelligence. And I would say that the Pentagon, the Israeli military, the PLA, every NATO country and military, they're actually far ahead of the private sector in their day-to-day use of artificial intelligence. And in fact, they use AI quite frequently in intelligence gathering, right? Part of that first strike that we saw on the Iranian leadership, right, was really tied to U.S. and Israeli advances in artificial intelligence in cyber and intelligence gathering. They're using it in operational aspects on a day-to-day basis, like we do, but also like logistics, supply chain, like the more prosaic aspects. But really the AI national security nexus is around weapons systems. And pretty much every emerging US weapons system has artificial intelligence, if not at its core, as part of the shift. And so from a AI narrative perspective, I want to underscore that every policymaker I talk to views AI through this national security lens, and therefore, they view it more in a zero-sum context. They believe whoever gets to AI first has this, big leg up in this broader great power competition aspect. Now we're seeing it in use in Iran every day. Of course, Ukraine has been pretty much the laboratory for battlefield applications of artificial intelligence, and that goes along with electronic warfare, with space, right? There's a whole suite of technologies, military technologies, that are dual use, civilian military, by the way, but are central to the way that wars are being fought today. And so when you think about artificial intelligence going forward, don't think of it only as impact on productivity, impact on wages, impact on various sectors. All of that's important, but I think that misses this core national security argument that I hear every day because I'm talking to the national security policymakers. So AI is very much part of this broader move towards national security priorities that I talked about at the beginning. Thank you for the question.
One more?
So I spent the last 2 weeks in the region. So I was in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, some other places. And the message that I had for the region is the same that I had for Brazil, which is if you look at the Trump administration priorities, not only in its actions, but in the, how it's thinking about the world, the latest US national security strategy explicitly puts LATAM and the Western Hemisphere in general as a core national security objective. And, generally what you see in the United States is there's a big national security strategy that gets put out early in administration that tends to be operationalized, and that tends to stick around for years and years, and it'll go past the current administration. That's what's happening right now, and that's what you've seen in the rhetoric, but most importantly, the actions by the Trump administration. So what did they do? They got into power. The first thing they did was try to go into Panama and talk about the Panama Canal, right, and forcing China out of that investment decision. What else did they do? They went immediately to Argentina, right, cut a deal with Milei, right? But again, in the broader context of great power competition, what else did they do? They pressure Colombia. They pressure Mexico. They do the military operation in Venezuela, right? So what I think is happening here is you're seeing a new focus on Latin America from the United States perspective. And so I think the whole region, and Brazil in particular, is moving from the periphery of great power competition really to the core of great power competition. And you're going to continue to see a US focus on the region. And at the same time, I think that creates tremendous opportunities for LATAM, for Brazil, for Chile, for Peru, for a bunch of countries, for Mexico, for Colombia. It'll be uneven, but I think LATAM has a lot to offer in the geopolitical context. As I said before, critical minerals is the focus right now. Latin America is a central node for that. And I think you're going to continue to see ongoing opportunities on a country-by-country basis to work more closely with Washington. And then Washington's ask back on these countries is going to be, please, reduce your dependencies on China. Please reduce your dependencies on Russia. Right? So again, I think the whole geopolitical shift that I outlined at the beginning is running through LATAM.
Uma última aqui antes da gente ir para o próximo bloco. No final vou fazer mais perguntas. Acho que tem o Chiesi, tem... Vamos lá.
Thank you. So my question is,
Thank you.
The US conducted a few strikes this weekend on the Kyrgyz Island, but only on military assets, right? And Trump even said that we might do it, we might hit it a few more times just for the fun of it, okay? But the thing is, he said we eventually might hit crude facilities if Iran does not stop attacking vessels on the Strait of Hormuz. If this were to happen, where would we go from there?
Yes, thank you. You're correct in focusing on that as the key variable going forward. I think the Karg Island operations over the weekend are pretty significant. And so far, they point to military logic. And the military logic is, how do you open the strait as quickly as possible? Again, that's the core variable. And Karg Island happens to be home to a lot of Iran's infrastructure when it comes to both missile capabilities, but especially mine-laying capacity. And so I think the initial military objective is to continue to degrade Iran's ability to basically use the strait as a choke point. Now, I think the other piece of that, like the threats to the production facilities, right, I think I would put that at the moment more in the rhetoric category, because it's in no one's interest, particularly not Trump's interest, to really, impact production, because that leads directly to increased prices, that leads directly to higher inflation, more domestic political challenges, right? So I think at the moment, the military focus remains on degrading those mine-laying capacities in particular. The U.S. has already conducted with Israel about 6,000 military strikes, military operations. That's a lot in 2 weeks. Most of those are focused on Iran's naval capabilities. I think the Pentagon today reported that about 1,000 Iranian ships have been targeted, right? But you can see what their focus is. Their focus is really on degrading that ability around the strait, and Karg Island is central to that. But again, that's the key variable to watch. And Iran could also eventually decide to target production facilities as well. So this is one of the escalation variables that I'm watching very carefully as this conflict goes on. And again, it's about duration, right? The longer the conflict goes on, the bigger the macro and market implications. And so to me, anything that points to duration signals on the war, you want to put up higher in your thinking.
Just to move on here, I will come back to questions at the end of the panel. For me, this is one of the main questions of the panel, okay? Because it brings the main topic for us, portfolio managers, asset allocators. This war has caused the biggest oil supply in history. We are seeing oil prices going sky high, commodity prices more than 40%. And for me, that means one thing: global inflationary pressure. What are markets' expectations regarding all of this? And should we expect higher rates for longer?
So I'll say a few things. One, that is the key variable. And that's why I keep emphasizing duration risk. And that's why I keep emphasizing flow through the strait. Like, those are the two variables that flow back directly to our calculations about how does this play out for the markets, for policy, for Fed, for other liquidity issues. So to me, that's the key variable. I would say as well, though, that it's not just crude. And I think the LNG, the natural gas piece of this, is almost as important from a duration perspective, particularly for countries like in Europe that are more susceptible to disruptions in LNG, given what's happened to the LNG market following Russia's invasion of Crimea, given that a lot of countries in North Asia in particular are vulnerable to this. And so to me, the expectations here go back to duration. And in general, I do think that this is a period of higher inflation. That's obvious. I think this adds a lot more complications to the Federal Reserve's policy going forward. And of course, we have a lot of questions at the moment about the Trump administration's approach towards the Federal Reserve, right? And so there are lots of questions here, but in general, and even beyond this current crisis, I want to suggest that, you know, as investors, that we don't really think about each of these geopolitical crises as individual events. I think what is happening here, and this is why I talk about the structural changes, this is why I mentioned the structural changes, and this is why I focus on US-China relations so much. If you look at every geopolitical issue that we're trying to manage through here, this war, obviously, Venezuela, Ukraine, South China Sea, East China Sea, of course, Taiwan, what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, right? The United States and China are on opposite sides of each one of those geopolitical challenges. So to me, you can't just think about this incident. This is not just a US, Israel, Iran situation, right? This impacts all of the region, but it also impacts those broader great power stresses that are flowing through the entire system. And this is why I have such strong conviction that the macro and supply chain and other impacts here are longer term, but they go back to this broader insecurity that we have and the policymakers have about national security. So, you know, I mentioned those 8 to 10 strategic sectors. I think we should be thinking about, well, what does that look like from a supply chain perspective, right? As, you know, more and more companies and more countries incentivize supply chain disruptions out of China into India, into Japan, into Mexico, into other places, right? How do supply chains get reordered? And in a world where the policy priorities are on national security and not economic efficiency, right? I think, you know, that is, you know, an environment that leads to structurally higher rates, probably structurally lower global growth that we saw during, you know, the heyday of globalization. At the same time, I think that leads to a much more differentiated outcome set, right? And so, you know, different outcomes. So we're going to have winners and losers really across the board as we go through this long-running geopolitical and policy shift. That's true at the regional level. I just talked about LATAM being a winner. I think that's true for parts of Southeast Asia as well. That's true at the country level. We're going to have a lot more dispersion of outcomes at a country-by-country basis, right? So I don't think you should think about EMs as a class, for example. I think you should look at individual countries and which countries have the most exposures, or conversely, which countries have the best toolkits to benefit from this. That's true at the industry level. We're going to have a lot more dispersion at the industry level, at the company level, at the asset class level, right? So yes, it is a challenging geopolitical environment to be sure, but at the same time, I think it's creating tremendous investment opportunities if you know where to look, if you understand that these geopolitical developments are really animating policy choices. And I think this is a long-term development. This is a long-term trend. This is going to go well beyond the Trump administration because these are structural changes in the geopolitical backdrop.
So if there are winners, even with this reshuffling of the cards, I wonder how sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, the most sophisticated investors of the globe, how they are repositioning their portfolios. How are they recalibrating portfolios?
So as part of my job, I spend a lot of my time talking with Wellington's top global clients. And so I have these conversations. They're ongoing conversations. And I'd say a couple things. One, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, right? It really depends on strategies or time horizons or, you know, appetite for risk. But in general, I'd say a couple things. One, we continue to see allocation towards the United States. Right? We haven't seen a collapse in allocations towards the U.S. market. So there is still an argument there for, you know, the U.S. exceptionalism piece of this, given the fact that the U.S. is still producing companies with outsized earnings, and has a lot of, I think there's a lot of fiscal impulse still in the U.S. Backdrop at the moment. So we're still seeing that. The other thing I'd say is we are seeing more diversification, global diversification, right? So there's an acknowledgement, I think, among the most sophisticated asset allocators that yes, diversification is an important strategy, but particularly in a world where you have this large potential outcome set. And so we've had a lot of interest in that. And then I'd say the biggest piece of this and the biggest reaction that I've seen really over the past 6 months or so is a lot more focus on long-short strategies and alternatives in particular. And so why is that? Well, I talked a lot about the winners and losers, right, across the board, and that's really what we've been focusing on, or what are the winners and losers at the regional level, country level, industry level, company level, asset class level, in this more dispersed and more disrupted geopolitical environment. And so we've seen a lot of attention being paid, particularly to long shorts. So those are some of the early moves that we're seeing. But in general, I do think you want to think about geopolitics not as like these discrete crises, but my argument is that you want to think about geopolitics as a core macro variable. It's with us. It's here to stay, right? We're in a new geopolitical regime. And that doesn't mean the other variables don't matter. Obviously they do, right? Inflation, growth, liquidity, Fed policy, monetary policy around the world, fiscal policy, all of those obviously still matter, but the geopolitics piece of this is playing a bigger role in impacting those other variables. And the reason why I talk so much about the long-term nature of these shifts is, over the short and medium terms, I think you want to steer into active strategies. But because these geopolitical cycles are so long, I think it's an opportune time to get exposure to long-term investment themes that are emerging as a result of this shift towards national security. So I spend a lot of time defense innovation, in particular, these dual-use civilian military applications in public markets, but also in private markets. I spend a lot of time on climate strategies, given that connection, right, to national security that I talked about. And so to me, these are fundamental shifts in the geopolitical backdrop that are impacting how we're thinking about short, medium, and long-term investment opportunities. Again, this is a big shift in the backdrop.
Fantastic. Just to wrap up here our session, maybe a couple of questions more. Chiesi, not sure if you still have a question.
Hi. How do you see this conflict in Iran affecting the midterms around the corner, and how would that affect the second half of the mandate?
Thank you.
Trump's mandate?
Thank you. I think it's a key variable in determining how long Trump can stomach the pain. And from what I'm hearing, they still think there's enough space. They have enough time. What I'm hearing is, this can go another month or two before it really bites on the midterm piece of it. I'm not sure that's true. And I'm watching a couple of things. The first thing that I'm watching is the number of Republicans who have already publicly said they're not going to run in November because they know that they're going to lose. We're up over 30. That is a very high number in existing candidates who are giving up this early. I think that tells you that there's a feeling within the Republican Party that this is going to be a very painful midterm election. My base case remains that the Democrats are going to take over the House, and the longer this war goes on, the higher the probability that they could actually take the Senate again. And I think even if you just see a switch in the House, that's going to have some pretty profound implications for the remainder of the Trump administration. The Democrats will have the ability, because they will control the House, to control the agenda. And they will have subpoena power to bring on anyone that they want for public hearings on the war, on immigration policy, on ICE, on corruption, on anything they want. And I think there's a very high probability that we'll see impeachment articles again, right? So, if we do get this outcome where we do have a change in government on Capitol Hill, I think that'll have some very important implications for the rest of the Trump administration. It will very much constrain them on the domestic side, less so on the foreign policy side. I still think you'll see an activist White House approach. But the other piece of the midterms that I think is very important here is to watch what are the domestic political narratives that are successful in November. Because I think those are the messages that the next presidential candidates will rally around. So is that affordability? Is that the war? Is that immigration? Right? We won't know yet until then. But I think the midterms will be an important signal for what kind of presidential election we should expect in 28 and what kinds of candidates we should be sort of focusing on now. So the midterms are important for those two very important reasons. It's also why I think Trump took a big gamble in this conflict, in starting this war. He was already losing support, particularly on the economy and particularly on inflation. Right? So how long this conflict goes on is really touching his weak spots at the moment, which is why I think we should really be monitoring those economic variables. What I hear from the White House is it's all about gas prices. Right? That's the pain point, particularly if the national average goes through round numbers. Like right now it's $3.30 something. If it goes up to $4, up to $5, right? It's those round numbers where the electorate really pays attention to. So watch that variable as well.
Final one, or should we wrap up here? Well, thank you so much. This was very clarifying, insightful. Acho que eu tenho uma mensagem grande aqui para a audiência da XP também. Definitivamente, na medida que a gente avança nesse programa de internacionalização, a gente vai sim ser cada vez mais demandado por estar antenado no que está acontecendo lá fora, por estar bebendo direto da fonte. E a gente tem parcerias com os melhores players do mundo. Muitos dos escritórios aqui, a gente tem estabelecido agendas recorrentes para falar de cenário macro, para falar de oportunidades, de riscos, de produtos, muitas vezes. Tá? Então, acho que a chave para o próximo passo é a gente ter essa proximidade para trocar todos esses insights, a gente alavancar as nossas operações em todos esses recursos de altíssima qualidade que a gente tem disponível aqui para o nosso ecossistema. A gente brinca, mas tem orgulho de falar, né, Zé? O Vitor Mazoneto também, que a gente traz a Champions League do mundo para estar aqui com a gente. Então, a gente não poderia estar em melhores mãos. E agradecer, parabenizar o trabalho maravilhoso, revolucionário que os escritórios, alocadores têm feito no Brasil. A grande verdade é que é inédito no Brasil. A gente nunca viu um movimento tão coordenado, um movimento tão profissional. A gente olha as operações aqui, estruturas inteiras que foram construídas para cobrir o internacional com uma série de pessoas competentes, mentes brilhantes. Então, tenho convicção que a gente está no caminho certo. Então, obrigado mais uma vez. And Thomas, once again, thank you so much. It was a privilege. We will still follow the next steps of all the conflicts, but above all, we wish all the best for humanity, for the globe. Sometimes these transitions, they have prices, right? But hopefully we will end up in a much better place.
Yeah, and I want to just emphasize one more time that this is a scary geopolitical outlook, but approach this with a sense of opportunity, not doom, opportunity, because again, these things only come around once per century. And if you have that right framing, I think we can do well here. So thank you very much. I trust Fabiano said some nice things about me in Portuguese. I'm just going to pretend that he did. But thank you so much for your time, for your questions. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiano. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you. Turma, a gente vai fazer uma pausa de 5 minutos para a gente tomar um café, esticar as pernas aí, bater um papo. Eu só vou pedir que vocês sejam pontuais, galera. A gente vai sair 5 minutinhos ali, pega um café, uma água e a gente retorna para o nosso último painel e depois a gente vai ter tempo aí, 2 horas para almoçar, trocar ideia. Eu conto com vocês, daqui a pouquinho eu chamo vocês de volta, beleza? Bom café!